Greetings everyone. This sooner than expected video is being brought to you by my employer. I set off to drive to Ohio today from New Hampshire. I drove about 1 hour and they called me and said to just hold up maybe another day. So I expect to perhaps leave tomorrow. I would not have uploaded a video in the slight reprieve, if you want to call it that, had I not received a message from one of my subscribers, Ivan the Heathen. Some of you might recall I made a video entitled Did Hitler Attack Pearl Harbor, in which I admonished my subscribers to start making videos. I think everyone has a unique perspective. Everyone has areas of expertise, relatively speaking, that they can contribute to. I realize there's a tendency for people to say everything's been said and done and that there's nothing I can contribute, and I just think that's totally fallacious. I also think a lot of people put themselves in a catch-22 situation where they think, well, I'm not that articulate, I'm not good at speaking, I'm not good at making videos, and so I'm not going to start because they won't be very good. And I think this is a catch-22. You won't get good unless you start doing it. I've had two people approach me and actually make videos now. Now, one of them, I won't say who it is, but I have watched, it's a good video about Marxism, and he's doing some revisions, I believe. It's not ready. And when it is, I will direct you all to it. But then Ivan the Heathen did make a video. Now, I isolated him in particular because, you know, a couple times he's given me many good book recommendations over the years and, you know, said, why don't you do a review on this? And as most of you know, I have a very large bookshelf already, most of which I haven't yet read. And although I appreciate the book recommendations, and I will buy these books and hopefully eventually read them, if the information is important and pertinent or interesting, you know, I don't see why I need to have a monopoly here. I think it would be really, really useful and good if people would read books on their own and offer their own reviews. And you can do these on books that other people have read. There's nothing wrong with doing a review of Man, Economy, and State or Human Action or The Problem with Political Authority or any number of other things. But it's especially true if you're going to read something that there's no reviews of currently. And so Ivan the Heathen, who's very well read, very intelligent, made one or two videos before, and I think that's it. You know, he had read this book about Pearl Harbor, about the widespread perception in the United States during the war, especially early in the war, that Nazi Germany was behind the attack to one degree or another. There's either the puppet master theory that they were controlling Japan, forcing them to go, including perhaps even, you know, directly aiding through the German fleet or the German Luftwaffe, or at the very least politically goading them to do it. And that this was the primary motivation for the United States going to war with Germany, and that the quote-unquote declaration of war made by Hitler later on December 10th, I want to say, maybe it was the 11th, I might have that wrong, was not the reason, and that this declaration was not actually a declaration of war. It was essentially an extremely bellicose speech that Hitler gave. The German government apparently a day or two later either retracted or clarified that it wasn't a declaration of war. And through the course of the conflict, it was never really mentioned, except in the context of it being irrelevant to hostilities. The hostilities were initiated by the Germans in Pearl Harbor. Now, when the war ended and German archives were opened, it became clear that the Germans not only did not order Pearl Harbor, that they weren't aware that it happened, and it certainly wasn't in their interest. It was the absolute opposite of everything that they had tried to do, which was to keep the United States out of the war, and attacking them at Pearl Harbor would certainly not aid in that effort. Now, most of this information is coming forward from a book, and Ivan the Heathen had read this book and was encouraging me to read it and then do a video on it, and I think the solution is quite obvious, that he should do a video on it. And so he took the time to go over the book again, and he has since posted a video, the title of which is Hitler, Pearl Harbor, Political Parasites and Journalistic Horrors, and I will put a link in it. I have taken the time to watch it. It's a fairly long video, but he goes over the information in a great deal of detail, citing news articles, citing State Department sources, citing actual, you know, FDR in a couple situations, to really walk you through in a very detailed, comprehensive, chronological way how Pearl Harbor was perceived and Germany's role in it, and how that changed and why it changed, and not just, you know, speculating, but providing evidence to that effect, and it's definitely worth watching and gaining that information. So I'll put a link, and I highly encourage you all to go watch it. Now, since this is me, I can't make, and then you know, for others of you who are still on the fence, please just start making videos about any topic whatsoever. You know, and it's not like I'm the only YouTuber, so I don't claim that, you know, it's all falling on me, but uh, within my subscriber base, I know there's a lot of you uh, that, you know, are really interested in this, and I know a lot of you have interesting perspectives. I have subscribers from all over the world. You know, I'm getting comments now from Israel, from Paraguay, from Finland, from Sweden, from Iceland, from the UK, from Australia, just to name some of the places that I'm getting a lot, from Brazil. And, you know, just by virtue of your nationalities, your mother languages, uh, you know, the perspectives you have from not being an American, and even if you are American, from different spots. You know, I've had subscribers who are LDS, I have subscribers who are Christians. It's very interesting. You know, the atheists, I never get any flack from atheists ever, and I definitely fall on the agnostic side, but I've had a lot of Christians kind of come forward and say they really appreciate myself, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, because I'm not a Christian and I don't, you know, evangelize Christianity, I think, but, you know, all those perspectives are interesting and worth expressing, and I just wish more of you would do it. And if you do it, let me know, because I'm not necessarily subscribed to my subscribers, and I won't know that this is happening unless people let me know. So I know there's at least one more in the works. I already, from what I saw, he's going to revise it. It's a very excellent, not Ivan the Heathen, but another one that I've seen. And I'm looking forward to that one coming out. So yeah, again, I emphasize, I think that this is a good idea. It's a good idea not just in the sense that you are furthering the dialogue, but that you're making yourself a better communicator. And, you know, I think that's all to the good. So that's that, just to get it done. Ivan the Heathen always says that he doesn't have time, and I said, look, the time you spend making comments is as much time as it takes to make a video. It doesn't have to be the most polished, the best. The only times I actually re-record videos is if I accidentally turn the mic off and I end up having a long video where there's no sound. Otherwise, it's always one take. And if there's something really horrible that I don't like, I'll not upload it. And there's a couple videos like that, including some that I think people would find very surprising and interesting that are probably never going to go up. But that's a different story. Alright, now I wanted to also address another question here. I don't think I want to go into a ton of detail. Another one of my subscribers named Gypsy Hustled, who I think has been a subscriber of mine for several years now, and who I didn't even realize was still watching. He and I had a series of PMs probably 2 or 3 years ago, and then I assumed that he wasn't watching anymore. And the last month, he's been commenting a great deal, which I definitely like and respect. It's kind of a shock, but he's not a straight up libertarian, like many of my other subscribers. And he posed here a question. Let's see, on this video, which video is this? On the being liberal means you never need a reason, which is not directly related to what he asks, but he says, I would like it if you could please do a video on wealth inequality. What is the general libertarian take on wealth inequality? Is it a problem or not? And what are the solutions? Thanks. Well, kind of the trick with this question is that it's asking what the libertarian position is, and then also kind of asking what is the actual, what is my opinion, essentially, which aren't necessarily the same thing. So, you know, I'm not going to speak as the voice of libertarianism. There's nobody who has that that moniker, even Murray Rothbard, and certainly not me. So these are going to be, this is kind of my take on it. Although I will say that most libertarians are probably going to agree with this. On its own, in and of itself, wealth inequality, I don't think can be considered a bad thing. The only way that you can kind of come to that conclusion is to adhere to some form of egalitarianism, and there are very few libertarians who hold to egalitarianism when it at least comes to wealth. Uh, egalitarianism in terms of ideas like justice, perhaps, or fairness, or the law, that sort of thing. But in terms of material wealth, which is explicitly what you're asking, Gypsy the Hustle, um, uh, there are probably almost none. Now, there's also a question of degree. Uh, does that mean libertarians are okay if one person owns everything and nobody else owns anything? Whether that's even logically possible is a separate question, I guess. I don't know. Maybe there are some libertarians who would disagree, or somewhere on the scale between that and total egalitarianism. I think that the emphasis on wealth disparity is interesting because it's a de facto acknowledgement that actual measurements of wealth don't facilitate increased government. It's definitely a moving of the goalpost. There's poverty and then there's wealth inequality. Poverty is when a person is in serious, when the material wealth is so low that survival or even basic, or at least basic health, are in great danger. You're going to die of starvation. You're going to die of poisoned water. You're going to be malnourished to the point that you're emaciated, that you won't be able to fight off disease, that you won't have any energy. There's that kind of poverty, and that kind of poverty exists in the world, and it's not that uncommon. We have what's called the bottom billion, the billion people who are the poorest, and many of them have that level of poverty, and that level of poverty does occasionally, in certain circumstances, creep into the West as well. There are places in the United States where something approaching that, or even including that, is possible. And this is ever and always the cry for government intervention to right this wrong. Now, mostly in the West, though, you don't see that kind of poverty, and actually in most of the world. It's not just the West that this is true any longer. And so, and since you can't complain about there being people starving to death in the street and babies dying in alleyways and rib kwashiorkor or edema, or starvation. I mean, famine has basically been abolished from the West. The last famine in the West, other than directly related to military action, was the potato famine in the 1840s. So, what is that? 170 years now in the past. So kind of the new catch-all justification for government intervention in terms of justice has been to point out wealth inequality. So even if the poor aren't poor, they're relative to the rich many times less wealthy, which is not the same thing necessarily as being poor. Having colored TVs and automobiles and a house and warm water and all the food that you can do, plumbing, DVDs, televisions, cell phones, which is what you're talking about when you're talking about poor people, at least in the United States. I don't know if poor is necessarily the right thing to say. These people are suffering to the degree that justice demands intervention. It's not clear at a visceral level that that's actually the case, unless you're coming at it from the idea that everyone needs to be equal, that that's an end in of itself, which I don't think is a justifiable, defensible kind of position for people to take. Nonetheless, that seems to be the basis for so much wealth redistribution rhetoric, state power, this wealth inequality. Let's see. The distribution of wealth itself is an interesting question. In general, I and libertarians, I think mostly, aren't going to object in principle to there being concentrations of wealth. If someone works hard and they provide a good service voluntarily, yada yada yada, you all know where this story is going to go. It's very hard to conclude then that accruing wealth in that manner is objectionable in any way, at least in terms of criminality or justice. If, on the other hand, the wealth is acquired through theft or for rent-seeking or through and all these crimes, they have corollaries in government action that are just not don't have the pejorative label of crime. So it's not considered, it's theft, but it's called taxation, or it's um, extortion, and then it's called rent seeking or regulatory capture or whatever else. Um, the thing is, with concentrations of wealth, they don't always fall into one or the other, and the only kind of way to look at a concentration of wealth is on an individual basis. To this person or this hoard of gold, was it piled up because of more or less legitimate libertarian activity, or free market, voluntary exchange, non-coercive, mutually beneficial, um, socially positive activity, or was it through coercion? And you just got to do that case by case. And of course, in a mixed economy like we have, uh, the level of degree is difficult to judge. I mean, if it's one thing if you're in a company and 100% of your income or 80% of your income is coming from the government and it's regulated to where you have a monopoly, and okay, it's hard to justify that. If on the other hand, the only thing that you have is a license that anybody can get, or it's not that difficult to get, or that's not actively being prevented from others earning it, it's harder to say, well, then you shouldn't have any of your money, or that you should only have a small fraction of it. In terms of the utility, and that's the moral, deontological kind of libertarian position, I would say. In terms of utility, I don't think it's look, money does buy influence and power, and that does allow for some abuse. I think, however, many people vastly overestimate the abuse that is possible through wealth alone. If we were to look at, say, Russia, who's the most powerful, dangerous person in Russia? It's Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin is not the richest person in Russia by any stretch of the imagination. Likewise, in the United States, there's a list of, I think the United States has something like 400 or 500 billionaires. And I don't know how many millionaires. I think it's in the tens of thousands, maybe more. Maybe a lot more, I'm not sure. And then you have Barack Obama. Now, who's the most powerful of all that group? It's Barack Obama. He's more powerful than George Soros or the Koch brothers. And he does more damage also. I mean, even not granting the most hyperbolic, brutal things that he's done, just the marginal destruction and woe on the margins of the laws that he signs is going to be worse than all the Koch brothers' abuses possible. And yet, he's not that wealthy. And so, the corollary between not the corollary, the correlation between wealth and power is not 100%, and it's the power that makes makes it much worse. The possession of wealth, even if it's a lot of wealth, doesn't give one the ability to aggress against others very much. I mean, to a degree, yes, you have wealth, so maybe you can hire a hitman, maybe you can afford a lawyer to defend yourself in the aftermath, that sort of thing. But there are very strong limits on that. Whereas if you have actual political power, those limits are essentially largely gone. And that's kind of the catch-22 for the people who argue for wealth redistribution based on the utilitarian argument that concentrations of wealth engender some kind of moral hazard. The government that you're going to need, or the institution if you don't want to use government, to even out the playing field, so to speak, is going to be capable of vastly more harm than any of the individual concentrations of wealth ever conceivably could be. And the incentives are much worse for them than they are for these legitimately, in libertarian terms, acquired concentrations of wealth. So it would be wrong to say that there's no problems, that it's impossible to abuse the wealth that you've earned, even if you've earned it legitimately. But the idea that that alone is enough, and this kind of, it goes into the whole anarcho-syndicalist Noam Chomsky kind of, yes, government's bad, but it's not really the government, it's the rich, corporations, it's the concentrations of wealth. That's the petty private tyrannies. That's the real issue, but it doesn't really square, because even in places where there aren't corporations, when they're either completely illegal or everything is state-run, or where there's very little in terms of corporations, you still have massive, massive, massive abuses. I mean, and it's cliche, but it's not an invalid example. You have North Korea or the USSR or Communist China, even today and in the past, or in Laos or in Cuba. Uh, you still have the abuses, even though the private concentrations of wealth are essentially abolished or greatly diminished. It's only and when we do have mixed economies, as we do in the United States, again, the worst abuses inevitably fall within the nexus of government. That they're never circumscribing the government or going around the government. I mean, the closest examples that I've seen that people argue would be like environmental catastrophes, most especially the BP oil spill. And even there, it doesn't really follow because the state had granted them limited liability. There was a cap on what they would be legally allowed to pay, which is not something that would seem very plausible in a society without a state making mandates like that. But that's the exceptional. Almost all other types of corporate abuse require, the very least, the tacit agreement and help of the government, even if it isn't intentional. And the other one would be the forming of cartels. People say, well, the private tyrannies will get together and form a cartel. This does not work on a free market. The profit incentives always ensures that the more efficient of the members of the cartel could make more money underbidding the less efficient members of the group. And it requires one to believe that, on the one hand, corporations are avaristic and capricious and only care about profits. It's the only thing that they exist to do. This is something you hear all the time. But suddenly, for a cartel to work, it would require that the primary goal of a corporation not be profits, but solidarity of the cartel. Doesn't follow that would be the case. It turns out, in reality, that the initial, characterization of corporations, that they're essentially exist only for profit, is more accurate, and that it's incompatible with the idea of cooperating cartels that are resisting the urge to underbid each other's competition. It is interesting how, on the one hand, they're attributed to being cutthroat competitors all the time, and on the other hand, they're always colluding, cooperating. Like it's kind of the rhetoric that the left uses for workers, that they're homogenous, mass of people who all have solidarity with each other and who are not interested in their own wages or their own lives or their own living standards. They're interested in the perceived power of their class, and that's kind of what they project onto corporations and wealthy individuals when they're arguing against the dangers of cartels, but not when they're arguing in any other sense, because in those that they have these different mutually exclusive kind of boogeymen that they like to trot out at different times, and they can switch between them at will, and it's very kind of frustrating. So concentrations in wealth, I think there's a big misconception. Because there are people who say, look, on a free market you wouldn't have concentrations of wealth, or they'd be much lower. I don't know how much of that is true. Obviously, many of the concentrations of wealth that we see are the result of state intervention. There's no question about that. Now, how much we can extrapolate on a free market that would be or would not be the case is difficult to say. What I will say is that on a free market, when there's no barriers to entry, when there's no legal prohibition of competition, that anything that is producing profits, which is the prerequisite for there being large, powerful corporations, are going to attract competitors, either new providers who are entering the market for the first time, or people who are providing other goods that are then going to diversify into this profitable area. And that, it's funny, it's the profits that are necessary to create the monopoly, but it's those same profits that will incentivize the growth of competition. And this is not meaning that concentrations of wealth are impossible or can't happen. But if you are in a dynamic economy where the circumstances are always changing, and they always will, we'll never be in equilibrium. We'll never be, until entropy has reduced the entire universe into a homogeneous state of inexistence or whatever. There's going to be variation and change, and the meaningful future of humanity on this planet there's radical changes, really. And this means that what's the most profitable, what's the most ideal situation is constantly shifting and changing. There is no silver bullet that's always going to work. There's something that's the best under the situations at this moment. And that's subject to change, sometimes radically. And the larger the concentration of wealth, it's actually harder and harder to adapt. There's advantages to being big and there are disadvantages to being big. And liberals are very aware of the advantages and they like to trump them up and talk about those all the time. There's utility, there's economy of scales, there's name recognition, that sort of thing, but they fail to realize there's diseconomies of scales, there's management issues, there's the socialist economic calculation problem, which starts to take place in firms, from the get-go. It happens in your family, it happens in your own private property, your own things. It's all yours, and there's no prices between, my gun and my silver and my bottle of water and my fish pillow. Fish pillow. I can look at market prices on the outside and try and extrapolate them in, but it's not 100%. And you get a corporation with hundreds of factories and millions of workers, and it's a difficult situation. And so, the thing the kind of metaphor that I use is that in a free market, concentrations of wealth a free market is very erosive to them. That doesn't mean that they can't exist. It means that capital, wealth, and profits are always flowing to whatever is best suiting the desires of consumers. And it is highly unlikely that any particular firm or concentration of wealth will consistently be able to do this to the point that it's always the biggest or that it's always getting bigger. Which is not to say they can't be large or even very large and even hegemonic to a point, at least in terms of their size. It just seems it's very unlikely. It's always going to be shifting to what suits consumer needs best, what suits the market best. And the market there being a metaphor. The market's not like this disembodied entity that's pulling levers, but I think you all realize, what I mean by that. So I think for a libertarian free market economy, you're going to see in certain industries there are not necessarily natural monopolies, but natural congregations or natural industries that naturally kind of lend to a few larger firms versus some that tend towards more. And like obvious examples would be rare earth elements or something that is mined or produced and is only able to be produced in a few areas. You're not going to see a plethora of platinum producers probably, in the near future. Or as far as I know, it's only really mined in 3 countries right now, at least in industrial quantities. Like there's one mine in Montana that does it, and then Russia and South Africa, and I believe that's it. Alright, so you're probably not going to see 1,000 firms that do that, although there might be quite a few in South Africa, if it wasn't all nationalized, which, as it happens, is the case, I believe. Same in Russia. But that's something I think that's kind of a little bit inevitable, and it's hard to see how that's necessarily bad. Also, there's the whole thing of substitutes. Like, there's lots of things you can use platinum for that it's the best thing for, and then there's lots of things that are second best providers of the good or service. And so, even if you have all the platinum, you don't necessarily have all the market for whatever it is you're trying to sell it for. So, yeah, although I'm perfectly willing to object to concentrations of wealth that are reliant on government. And like a really good one here would be like Rockefeller. And people always kind of think of Standard Oil as like, oh, that's the company that proves that we need government intervention. I think it's rather the opposite. David Rockefeller was like literally the most evil genius capitalist in the history of the world. Totally ruthless, totally dedicated, hardworking, and ingenious. And yet he was never able to eliminate all of his competition. He never became an monopoly. He was an innovator in a new industry and was able to, at maximum, achieve about 90% of the market, which at that point was not enough for him to jack up prices. He never got to the point of, I have a monopoly, now I can charge whatever I want. The only effect of all of his evil genius was to lower the price of gasoline for average Americans, and this, of course, helped more than anyone else the poor. Now, by the time the government stepped in, he'd actually lost that his market share had gone down, I believe, to 60 or 70%. Maybe it was 80, but it was less than it had reached in its apogee, and or apogee. I don't know which one's correct. I like them both. And it was only with the federal mandate that created an oligopoly in oil refinery, so that the number of oil refineries in the United States is set and the producers is set, that you have, okay, no one else can enter the market. They have on this level of the oil industry, there's a bottleneck that Standard Oil had, a huge market share in. If it wasn't for their foreign competitors like BP and Shell, they control all of it. So, that's an interesting case of, the market, not allowing there to be a monopoly, and then the government is stepping in and essentially creating one, so we could all pay more for gas for the rest of our lives and be tethered to it. And not to mention all the other subsidies like building the roads, which was very good for the oil industry. So, yeah, I don't think that there's anything per se wrong with concentrations of wealth. I think that I'm sure that they would exist in a free market society. I've heard this number bandied about. I don't know if it's really true, but there's the so-called 80-20 spread, where the top 20 always own 80% of the wealth, and actually you can subdivide any subgroup. So if you took the top 20, there's an 80-20 spread, and then you took the top 1%, there's an 80-20 spread. And I don't know, that probably doesn't always make sense. I'm sure if we took the 5 richest people in the country, that 20% of it would be owned by the richest one. That's probably not true. So I guess I would hesitate to agree with that, but something like that doesn't seem implausible to me. And it's not something that the government can really address without being worse. It's the only way it could try and cure that is to be an even greater concentration of wealth, which would not be a good thing even on its own terms. And again, I don't buy into the whole egalitarianism thing. I think that's very problematic. There's enormous incentive problems when you're talking about equalizing wealth. I will also point out that the government has been growing enormously, and yet the inequality has increased. And I think this is very good evidence that the notion that government intervention, the government is some sort of steamroller or a rolling pin that evens everybody out. This is not true, at least empirically. Even to the point where the people in the government are obviously not being disempowered or impoverished or made more equal. But even when the people who aren't members of the government, they're not becoming more equal either. And it's kind of interesting. They have basically often a non-falsifiable belief that, well, the inequality is just because there isn't enough government. And that's you can always say it's not big enough. It could get to the point where it consumes the entire economy, and you could just say, well, if the economy was bigger and it still consumed all of it, then it would be more equal. There's no end to it, and there's no correlation either. So how are you coming to that conclusion is really kind of interesting. It's showing that there's a preconceived kind of bias that is overriding all sensory information, which I'm not surprised for some of these people. And not all sensory. I think sometimes the only thing that really wakens people up is real life. No amount of argument or logic or citation of empirical data is going to really shake their resolve. But sometimes actual stimuli from the real world kind of does, but even then, not always. So, anyway, thanks for the question, Gypsy Hustle. I'm glad to have you on my channel and making comments. I especially loved your comments on the, should I even say, on the circumcision video. But yeah, I don't know why. You've suddenly become much more talkative, and that's cool. If anyone else here is watching these and you've been a lurker for all these years and never commented, let me know. It's not a ploy to generate revenue for my channel, because I don't get any revenue for my channel. I'm just genuinely interested in who's watching and who's listening. It's kind of out of the blue when people send me a message like, oh, I've been listening for 6 months, and it's just very odd when you find someone's listened to what could potentially be hundreds of hours of you talking, and you don't know anything about them, and they know, taken together, enough personal information is conveyed in these interviews, in these little vlogs here, that some of you can get a very pretty broad idea about me, at least within what I outline here. So, although most of you have no idea what my name is, I have a lot of people who think my name is Arthur, and that's not correct. My name is not Arthur. Um, but anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it. Check out Ivan the Heathans video. I'll put a link in the description. And anyone else who's interested in doing book reviews or doing videos about anything, please do so and let me know if you are going to do that, just so I can see it and I'll refer people to it. If I think it's okay, if I review it and I think it's shit, I might not. But yeah, like, we all are unique. We all have our own perspective, and you never know. Someone might be persuaded. I know my style's not for everybody, and so that wouldn't be a good reason, though, for me to never speak. You know, I think I'm pretty aware that, like, the large majority of the people in the world are not going to get very much out of my videos, or anything out of my videos. And that would have been, by the logic a lot of my subscribers have used, been a sufficient justification for me to never post anything. And I don't know, if you're watching this and you're to this point in the video, I think it's safe to assume that you would find that that would have been a mistake. And the same is very likely true of you, whoever you are, and whatever you want to say. So that's that. And again, I think I'll be actually leaving tomorrow. If not, we'll see. But this might be it for a while. So until next time.